The Mountain Brothers, who chained their female cousin in their dugout. That's what Martha Keene whispered to a traveling preacher on her deathbed in 1899. A confession that would crack open 20 years of buried horror in the Missouri Ozarks. Two brothers, one 15-year-old girl, chains bolted to stone walls in an underground prison. They called their right as men. For months, Lily was their captive, their mountain bride, until she became pregnant, and they decided she was too much trouble. But the horror didn't end with her captivity. Martha made a choice that haunts every word of her dying breath, a choice between watching her cousin die slowly or taking matters into her own hands. The brothers buried the evidence. The town buried the truth. And when one man tried to dig up justice, he discovered that some secrets are guarded by an entire community's silence. What happened in that dugout was unspeakable, but what happened after might be even worse. The October wind cut through Samuel Hartwell's coat like a blade as he urged his weary horse up the narrow mountain path toward Pine Hollow. At 45, Samuel had ministered to the dying in dozens of forgotten settlements scattered across the Missouri Ozarks. But something about this place felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air carried secrets too dark for daylight. The trees pressed close on either side of the trail, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday, shadows pulled in the hollows between the rocks like spilled ink. Pine Hollow revealed itself reluctantly, emerging from the forest like a guilty thought, a collection of weathered cabins and ramshackle buildings huddled together in a narrow valley, smoke rising from chimneys in thin, desperate lines. Samuel counted perhaps 60 souls living here, maybe fewer. The kind of isolated mountain community that survived on suspicion and silence, where outsiders were tolerated only as long as necessary and never truly welcomed. He had been summoned by Doc Harrison, the settlement's aging physician, to provide final comfort to a dying woman named Martha Keene. "She's asking for a preacher," Harrison's letter had said, "says she needs to make peace with the Lord before she passes." Samuel had performed this sacred duty countless times before, sitting beside deathbeds, holding weathered hands, offering prayers and absolution to souls preparing for their final journey. It was work that required patience, compassion, and the ability to listen without judgment as people unburdened themselves of lifelong regrets. But as he rode deeper into Pine Hollow, Samuel felt an unfamiliar unease settling in his chest. The few residents he passed on the muddy main street watched him with eyes that held more than mere curiosity. There was weariness there, and something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. The King cabin sat apart from the others, perched on a small rise at the edge of the settlement, like a house ashamed of itself. Samuel tied his horse to the weathered fence post and approached the door, noting the way the windows seemed to stare at him like hollow eyes. Doc Harrison answered his knock, a thin, grey-haired man whose hands shook slightly as he gestured Samuel inside. "She's been waiting for you," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hasn't said much to anyone else for weeks, but when I mentioned sending for a preacher, she grabbed my arm so tight she left bruises. Said she had something that couldn't wait for the next world." The cabin's interior was sparse and cheerless, containing little more than a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Martha Keene lay beneath a thin quilt, her body so wasted by consumption that she seemed almost translucent in the dim light filtering through the single window. At 38, she should have been in the prime of her life. But disease and something deeper, something that seemed to eat at her from within, had aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair, streaked with premature grey, spread across the pillow like spilled water. And her eyes, when they fixed on Samuel, held a terrible intensity that made him pause in the doorway. "You're the preacher," she said, her voice a dry whisper that somehow carried clearly across the small room. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded and approached the bed, removing his hat and setting it on the nearby chair. "I am, Sister Samuel Hartwell. I've come to offer whatever comfort I can." Martha's lips moved in what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a bitter recognition of something Samuel didn't yet understand. "Comfort," she repeated, as if the word were foreign to her tongue. "I don't think there's any comfort for what I need to tell you." Samuel had heard many deathbed confessions in his years of ministry. Adultery, theft, lies that had destroyed families, cruelties both small and large. He settled into the chair beside Martha's bed with the patient demeanor of a man accustomed to human frailty, prepared to offer forgiveness and peace to whatever sins weighed on this dying woman's soul. But when Martha's hand shot out with surprising strength and gripped his wrist, her fingers digging into his flesh like claws, Samuel felt his assumptions crumble. The words that came from her lips in a desperate rush would shatter his understanding of human evil and haunt him for the rest of his days. "I killed my cousin Lily," Martha whispered, her grip tightening until Samuel could feel his pulse throbbing against her fingers. "But what my brothers did to her first, God help me, I should have killed them too." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Samuel felt the world shift beneath him. This was no ordinary sin seeking absolution. This was something that would require him to confront depths of human cruelty he had never imagined. Martha's eyes never left his face as she continued, her voice gaining strength as if speaking the words aloud was feeding some desperate hunger that had been growing inside her for 20 years. "It was 1879. I was 18 and Lily was just 15 when her parents died of fever. She came to live with us, me and my brothers, Jacob and Ezra, because we were her only family left. At first, everything seemed normal, but then strange things started happening. Lily would disappear for hours, and when I asked where she'd been, she'd get this look in her eyes like a trapped animal. My brother said she was helping with chores, but I never saw her doing any work. And at night, I'd hear sounds coming from outside, crying, sometimes screaming. But when I looked out the window, I couldn't see anything." Martha's breathing became more labored, but she pressed on with the desperate urgency of someone running out of time. "One day, I followed the sounds. Out behind our property, past the tree line, there was this dugout carved into the hillside. My brothers had built it years before, said it was for storing root vegetables, but when I got close, I heard Lily's voice coming from inside, not crying now, but talking to herself, counting, always counting. I crept closer and looked through a gap in the wooden door they'd built, and what I saw," Martha's voice broke, and tears began streaming down her wasted cheeks. "They had her chained to the walls, like an animal. Heavy iron shackles around her ankles, connected to bolts they'd driven deep into the stone. She was counting the links in the chain over and over, like it was the only thing keeping her sane." Samuel felt his stomach turn as Martha's words painted a picture of horror beyond his comprehension. But he forced himself to remain still, to listen, to bear witness to this terrible truth that had been buried for 20 years. Martha's grip on his wrist had become painful, but he didn't try to pull away. He sensed that breaking this connection might stop the flow of words that had been dammed up inside her for so long. Martha's death haunted Samuel through 3 sleepless nights, her final words echoing in his mind like a curse that wouldn't release its hold. She had died before revealing where Lily's body lay buried, taking that crucial piece of information to her grave, along with 20 years of suffocating guilt. But the confession itself burned in Samuel's chest with the intensity of righteous fire. Here was an injustice so profound, so completely buried by fear and complicity, that exposing it felt like a sacred calling. Samuel had spent his adult life believing that truth was the foundation of healing, that dragging secrets into the light would cleanse communities of their sins and allow genuine peace to take root. Standing beside Martha's Fresh grave in Pine Hollow's small cemetery, watching the handful of mourners disperse without meeting his eyes, Samuel made a vow that would prove more dangerous than any promise he had ever uttered. He would find Lily Keene's remains and give her the justice that 20 years of silence had stolen from her memory. Samuel began his investigation with the methodical patience of a man accustomed to earning trust in suspicious communities. He spent his days moving through Pine Hollow like a gentle shepherd, offering pastoral care to anyone who would accept it, while carefully steering conversations toward the settlement's history. The older residents remembered the Keene family well enough. Jacob and Ezra had been known as hard men, even by mountain standards, quick to violence and slower to forgiveness. Their father had raised them to believe that strength meant taking what they wanted without apology, and their mother had died young under circumstances no one cared to examine too closely. Most people claimed to remember Lily only vaguely, describing her as a quiet girl who had lived with her cousins for a short time before running off to seek her fortune in St. Louis, as many young mountain women did when life became unbearable. But Samuel's years of ministry had taught him to read the spaces between words, to recognize the telltale signs of communal lies told so often they had taken on the weight of truth. When he mentioned Lily's name, conversations died like snuffed candles. I shifted away, voices became carefully neutral, and people found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Pine Hollow carried a collective secret about Lily Keene's fate, and the entire community had conspired to maintain that silence for 2 decades. Samuel's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elderly Mrs. Patterson, the settlement's unofficial keeper of memories, pulled him aside after a Sunday service he had conducted in the makeshift church. Her voice shook as she spoke, but her words were clear enough to chill Samuel's blood. "There were others," she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear. "Not just Lily. Other girls who lived with families after their parents died. Girls who supposedly ran away to the cities, but I remember them as children. They weren't the type to leave without saying goodbye. They were good girls, obedient girls, the kind who would never abandon their duties unless something terrible drove them away." Mrs. Patterson's revelation opened a horrifying vista of possibilities. Samuel began researching the settlement's records with new urgency, discovering a pattern that made his hands shake as he turned the pages of birth and death registers. Between 1875 and 1885, at least 6 young women had disappeared from Pine Hollow, all of them orphaned girls living with male relatives, all of them allegedly seeking better lives in distant cities. The timing coincided perfectly with the Keene brothers' most active years, when they were young men filled with violent appetites and protected by a community that valued family reputation over individual lives. Armed with this knowledge, Samuel rode out to the abandoned Keene property, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The homestead sat in a narrow valley surrounded by dense forest. The main cabin collapsed into itself like a broken promise. But behind the ruined house, exactly where Martha had described, Samuel found the dugout carved into the hillside. The wooden door had rotted away, leaving the stone chamber exposed like an open wound. Samuel forced himself to enter the underground space, lighting a lantern to pierce the darkness that had hidden 20 years of secrets. What he discovered there would visit his nightmares for the rest of his life. Heavy iron bolts were still embedded in the stone walls, their metal surfaces stained with rust that might once have been blood. Scratches covered every accessible surface, desperate marks that could only have been made by fingernails clawing at unyielding stone, some forming crude calendars that suggested the dugout's victims had tried to maintain their sanity by tracking the passage of time. In one corner, Samuel found fragments of cloth and what appeared to be human hair, brittle with age, but unmistakably real. The chamber reeked of ancient suffering, and Samuel had to step outside twice to vomit before he could complete his examination of the evidence. But discovering the dugout was only the beginning of Samuel's quest for justice. He needed to find bodies to locate the physical proof that would make Martha's confession impossible to dismiss or ignore. More importantly, he needed the cooperation of Pine Hollow's legal authorities to pursue charges against anyone who might still be alive and complicit in these crimes. Samuel approached Sheriff Coleman with the confidence of a man who believed that right would inevitably triumph over wrong, carrying his evidence like a shield that would protect him from the darkness he was trying to expose. Sheriff Coleman listened to Samuel's presentation with the patience of a man humoring a child's fantasy, his weathered face betraying no emotion as Samuel described the dugout, the physical evidence, and Martha's deathbed confession. When Samuel finished speaking, Coleman leaned back in his chair and studied the preacher with eyes that had gone cold and calculating. "That's quite a story, Reverend," Coleman said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute dismissal. "But stories are all they are. Martha Keene was dying of consumption. Disease like that affects the mind, makes people see things that never happened, remember things that never were." Samuel felt his confidence begin to crack as Coleman continued. "Those Keene boys were rough, I'll grant you that. But they're 20 years dead from drink and violence, same as half the men of their generation. As for missing girls," Coleman shrugged with theatrical indifference, "mountain folk have always been restless. Young women especially get ideas about city life, about opportunities beyond these hills. They run off all the time, then and now. Always have, always will." When Samuel pressed harder, describing the physical evidence in the dugout, and demanding that Coleman investigate the potential burial sites Mrs. Patterson had suggested, the sheriff's demeanor shifted from dismissive to threatening. Coleman stood slowly, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip, and moved around his desk until he was standing directly in front of Samuel. "Some stories are better left buried, preacher," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "For everyone's sake, you're new here. So maybe you don't understand how things work in places like Pine Hollow. We take care of our own. We don't air our dirty laundry for outsiders to judge, and we sure don't appreciate strangers stirring up trouble about things that happened before they ever set foot in our community." Samuel left the sheriff's office with his righteousness intact, but his innocence shattered. He had discovered that Pine Hollow's conspiracy of silence extended far beyond the Keene family. It was woven into the very fabric of the community's identity, protected by law enforcement and sanctified by 2 decades of collective amnesia. But rather than deterring him, Coleman's threats only strengthened Samuel's resolve. He had found his calling in this forgotten valley, a mission that would test every principle he held sacred and force him to confront the terrible complexity of seeking justice in a world built on carefully maintained lies. Sheriff Coleman's threats had the opposite of their intended effect on Samuel Hartwell. Rather than driving him away from Pine Hollow, the encounter crystallized his understanding that he was confronting not just individual crimes, but an entire system designed to protect perpetrators while silencing victims. Samuel had spent his ministry witnessing the damage that secrets could inflict on communities, but he had never encountered anything approaching the scope of corruption that seemed to permeate every aspect of life in this isolated mountain settlement. The realization that law enforcement was actively complicit in covering up decades of abuse filled Samuel with a cold fury that burned away his remaining illusions about the simple righteousness of his mission. Samuel's investigation took on new urgency as he began to understand the true dimensions of what Martha Keene had revealed. Working with methodical determination, he spent his days mapping the social connections between Pine Hollow's families, tracing bloodlines and marriages back through generations of mountain genealogy. What emerged was a web of relationships so tangled and interdependent that nearly every household in the settlement shared some connection to either the Keene brothers or their victims. The community's silence wasn't just born of fear or indifference. It was a survival mechanism that protected relatives, neighbors, and friends from confronting their own complicity in crimes they had chosen not to see. Samuel's most significant breakthrough came through Doc Harrison, who approached him one evening with the haunted look of a man preparing to confess his own sins. Harrison had been Pine Hollow's physician for over 30 years, and his medical knowledge gave him insights that other residents either lacked or chose to ignore. "I've been carrying this burden for too long," Harrison said, his hands shaking as he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. "I knew what was happening to those girls. Not the specifics, maybe, but I treated injuries that told their own story. Broken bones that healed wrong, scarring that suggested prolonged abuse, infections that could only come from—" Harrison's voice broke, and he took a long drink before continuing. "I told myself I was just a doctor, that my job was to treat symptoms, not ask uncomfortable questions. But I was a coward who let those girls suffer because speaking up would have made my own life difficult." Harrison's confession opened the floodgates to other revelations. The doctor knew which families had histories of violence against their female relatives, which households had disciplinary problems that neighbors pretended not to notice, and most crucially, where some of the bodies might be buried. He led Samuel to a remote hollow about 3 miles from the settlement, a natural depression in the mountains that the older families had used as an unofficial cemetery for decades. "It's where they buried the inconvenient dead," Harrison explained as they picked their way through the underbrush. "Stillborn babies, family members who died under suspicious circumstances, anyone whose death might raise questions they didn't want to answer." The hollow revealed its secrets reluctantly. Samuel and Harrison spent days carefully excavating the area, using Harrison's medical knowledge to identify human remains among the animal bones and natural debris that littered the forest floor. What they uncovered was a charnel house that spoke of systematic violence spanning generations, the bones of young women showing signs of trauma, children who had died too young under mysterious circumstances, and evidence of burials so hastily conducted that personal effects had been left with the bodies. Among the remains, Samuel found a tarnished locket that matched Martha's description of the one Lily had worn, containing a faded photograph of a young woman whose face held echoes of Martha's features, but carried none of her cousin's haunted desperation. But Samuel's investigation had not gone unnoticed by Pine Hollow's residents, and the community's response grew increasingly hostile as word spread about the preacher's activities. Samuel returned to his modest camp one evening to find his horse dead in its makeshift corral, its throat cut with surgical precision that suggested both cruelty and deliberate intimidation. His tent had been searched and vandalized, his belongings scattered and destroyed, and threatening messages had been carved into nearby trees with the same methodical violence that had killed his mount. The messages were simple and direct. "Leave now, or join the bones." "Strangers die in these mountains, and most chillingly, we know where you sleep." Samuel understood that he had crossed an invisible line in his pursuit of justice, moving from unwelcome curiosity to active threat in the community's collective mind. But rather than retreating, he doubled down on his investigation. Driven by a righteous fury that had transformed his initial compassion into something harder and more dangerous, he began approaching Pine Hollow's residents with direct accusations rather than gentle questions, confronting the descendants of perpetrators with evidence of their families' crimes and demanding acknowledgement of wrongs that had been carefully buried for decades. Samuel's most explosive confrontation came with the Hendricks family, whose patriarch had been closely connected to the Keene brothers during their most violent years. Samuel appeared at their door carrying Lily's locket and detailed documentation of the hollow's contents, presenting his evidence with the fervor of an Old Testament prophet calling down divine judgment. "Your grandfather knew what Jacob and Ezra were doing to those girls," Samuel declared, his voice carrying across the Hendricks property with enough volume to attract neighbors. "He helped them hide their crimes, and your family has been living off that silence ever since. It's time to acknowledge what happened and make amends for the suffering your people enabled." The confrontation backfired spectacularly. Rather than producing shame or acknowledgement, Samuel's public accusations triggered a defensive response that united the community against him with unprecedented solidarity. The Hendricks family had roots in Pine Hollow that stretched back 3 generations, and attacking them was perceived as attacking the settlement's fundamental identity. Samuel had miscalculated the power of shared culpability by threatening to expose one family's complicity. He had implicitly threatened everyone who had participated in the conspiracy of silence that protected them all. Samuel's final mistake was underestimating how deeply the community's survival was intertwined with its secrets. Pine Hollow existed in isolation, partly by choice and partly by necessity, sustained by relationships and loyalties that transcended conventional morality. The settlement's residents had spent decades learning to live with knowledge that would have destroyed other communities, developing emotional and social strategies that allowed them to function despite carrying unbearable truths. Samuel's investigation threatened to destroy those carefully constructed defenses, exposing not just historical crimes, but the ongoing complicity that had allowed the community to survive their aftermath. The breaking point came when Samuel announced his intention to contact federal authorities and newspaper reporters to bring outside scrutiny to Pine Hollow's long-buried secrets. That night, his remaining belongings were burned in a bonfire, visible from miles away, and Samuel found himself completely isolated in a community that had decided he represented an existential threat to their way of life. But even as the flames consumed his possessions, Samuel felt the intoxicating certainty of a man who believed he was fighting on the side of absolute righteousness, unaware that his crusade was about to cost more than he had ever imagined possible. Samuel's crusade reached its climax on a bitter November morning, when he stood before Pine Hollow's makeshift town hall, clutching a leather satchel filled with evidence that he believed would finally force the community to confront its buried sins. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, organizing his findings into an irrefutable case that detailed not just the Keene brothers' crimes, but the systematic pattern of abuse that had poisoned the settlement for generations. Samuel's righteous certainty burned so bright that it blinded him to the desperate faces, watching from doorways and windows, faces that belonged not to criminals avoiding justice, but to survivors who had spent decades learning to live with truths too terrible to acknowledge publicly. The town meeting that Samuel had demanded drew nearly every adult resident of Pine Hollow, cramming the small building beyond its capacity until people spilled out onto the covered porch and into the muddy street. Samuel began his presentation with the methodical precision of a prosecutor laying out a case before a jury, displaying Lily's locket sketches of the dugout's interior and detailed maps showing the locations where he and Doc Harrison had discovered human remains. His voice carried the thunder of righteous condemnation as he named names, identified living descendants of perpetrators, and demanded that Pine Hollow acknowledge the systematic abuse that had flourished in their community for decades. But instead of the cathartic moment of truth Samuel had envisioned, his revelation triggered a reaction that shattered his understanding of justice and community healing. The crowd's response was not shame or acknowledgement, but raw, desperate anger, directed not at the crimes he had exposed, but at Samuel himself for bringing these secrets into the light. Voices rose in a cacophony of denial and accusation as residents shouted over each other, defending family members and attacking Samuel's credibility with a vehemence that bordered on hysteria. "Those are lies told by a dying woman out of her head with fever," someone yelled from the back. "You are nothing but a troublemaker trying to destroy good families with old gossip and fairy tales." Samuel watched in horror as the community rallied not around justice for the victims, but around protecting their own from the consequences of historical crimes. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Pine Hollow's silence, assuming it was based on fear when it was actually founded on a complex web of survival, loyalty, and shared complicity that bound the settlement together like invisible chains. Many of the people in that room were related to both perpetrators and victims, carrying bloodlines that connected them to every aspect of the tragedy Samuel was trying to expose. His demand for justice threatened to tear apart families and relationships that had taken decades to rebuild after the original trauma. The devastating blow to Samuel's crusade came when he realized how badly he had misjudged the living victims whose cause he claimed to champion. Rebecca Mills stood up from her seat near the front of the room, her face pale but determined as she faced the crowd that had tormented her for decades with their knowing looks and whispered conversations. "You want to know the truth about what happened to us girls?" Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of lived experience. "The truth is that we survived by learning to be invisible, by building lives where nobody asked questions we couldn't answer. And now, this outsider wants to drag us all back to the worst moments of our lives for his own satisfaction." Rebecca's words hit Samuel like a physical blow as she continued her devastating testimony. "I don't need his justice. I needed help 20 years ago when I was chained in a cellar, but nobody offered it then. I needed support when I finally escaped and tried to build a life, but this community made sure I stayed isolated and afraid. And now, when I finally found some peace, he wants to destroy that too by making my private hell into public entertainment." Samuel watched in stunned silence as other survivors nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting not gratitude for his intervention, but resentment at his presumption in speaking for them without their consent. The community's anger reached a crescendo when Samuel announced his intention to contact federal marshals and newspaper reporters to bring outside scrutiny to Pine Hollow regardless of what the residents wanted. "This isn't about what you want," Samuel declared with the fervor of a man convinced of his own righteousness. "This is about justice for the dead and accountability for crimes that have been hidden too long. Whether you cooperate or not, the truth will come out, and those responsible will face the consequences they've avoided for 20 years. Samuel's words were met with a roar of outrage that shook the building's timbers, and he found himself facing a room full of people who saw him not as a champion of justice, but as an existential threat to their way of life. Samuel's moral certainty began to crack when Doc Harrison pulled him aside after the disastrous meeting, the old physician's face etched with regret and something approaching pity. "You don't understand what you've done," Harrison said quietly, his hands shaking as he poured himself another drink. "Rebecca Mills is already packing to leave town. Says she can't stay now that everyone's talking about what happened to her again. The other survivors are terrified that their families will be torn apart by investigations and publicity. You came here to help the victims, but you're destroying the lives they've managed to build on the ruins of their trauma." The full horror of Samuel's miscalculation became clear over the following days as Pine Hollow turned against him with unified hostility. Rebecca Mills disappeared in the night, leaving behind only a note saying she was seeking safety where nobody knew her story. The other survivors retreated into deeper isolation, refusing to speak with Samuel or anyone else about their experiences. Doc Harrison's medical practice was boycotted by families who blamed him for enabling Samuel's investigation, and the old physician began drinking more heavily. As his guilt compounded with each passing day, Samuel found himself completely alone in a community that had decided he represented a greater threat than the original crimes he had tried to expose. His camp was vandalized nightly. His attempts at conversation were met with hostile silence, and threatening messages appeared everywhere he went. But worse than the physical intimidation was the growing realization that his pursuit of abstract justice had caused concrete harm to the very people he had claimed to champion. Samuel's righteous certainty crumbled as he was forced to confront the possibility that his crusade had been driven not by genuine compassion, but by his own need to be the hero of a story that wasn't his to tell. The crushing weight of his failure settled on Samuel's shoulders as he sat alone in the ruins of his camp, surrounded by the ashes of his belongings and the wreckage of his assumptions about justice and healing. He had come to Pine Hollow believing that truth was always preferable to lies, that exposure was always better than concealment, and that moral clarity could overcome any obstacle. Instead, he had learned that some truths were too dangerous to speak, that some secrets served as protection rather than prison, and that the pursuit of justice without the consent of victims could become just another form of violence against those who had already suffered enough. Samuel Hartwell spent 3 days sitting in the ruins of his burned camp, staring at the charred remains of his belongings, while wrestling with the catastrophic realization that his pursuit of justice had become an instrument of fresh cruelty. The ashes of his tent and possessions seemed to mock his earlier certainty, each blackened fragment representing another assumption about righteousness and healing that had proven dangerously naive. For the first time in his adult life, Samuel questioned not just his methods, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to serve others, to bear witness to suffering, and to seek redemption in a world where good intentions could inflict wounds as deep as any malicious act. The morning of the 4th day brought an unexpected visitor to Samuel's makeshift shelter. A young woman approached through the forest, moving with the careful alertness of someone accustomed to watching for danger, and Samuel recognized her as Mary Caldwell, one of the few residents who had shown him anything approaching sympathy during his investigation. Mary carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and her face bore the expression of someone delivering both sustenance and unwelcome truth. "Doc Harrison sent this," she said quietly, setting down bread, dried meat, and a bottle of clean water. "Says you'll starve if somebody doesn't look after you, and he's got enough guilt without adding your death to his conscience." Mary's presence offered Samuel the first real conversation he'd had since his world collapsed, and her words carried a gentleness that felt foreign after days of hostility and isolation. "You meant well," she said, settling onto a fallen log near his small fire. "Nobody doubts your intentions were good, but good intentions don't undo damage once it's done, and they don't bring back people who've been driven away by things they never wanted exposed." Mary had known Rebecca Mills since childhood, and her account of Rebecca's midnight departure painted a picture of a woman fleeing not just Pine Hollow, but the possibility that her carefully constructed new identity might be destroyed by unwanted publicity and investigation. Samuel listened with growing horror as Mary described the ripple effects of his crusade. Throughout the small community, the survivors he had claimed to champion were retreating deeper into isolation, their fragile sense of safety shattered by the sudden attention focused on secrets they had spent decades learning to carry in private. Families were fracturing under the weight of accusations and counter-accusations, as relatives chose sides between loyalty to the living and justice for the dead. Children were asking questions their parents couldn't answer without revealing truths that would destroy innocence and complicate relationships that had provided stability for years. Samuel's pursuit of abstract justice had created a cascade of concrete suffering that touched nearly every household in Pine Hollow. The conversation that finally broke through Samuel's defensive wall of righteousness came from an unexpected source. Thomas Keene, great-nephew of the brothers whose crimes had started Samuel's investigation, appeared at the camp as evening shadows gathered, his face bearing the weight of inherited shame and complicated loyalties. Thomas was 25 years old, married with 2 young children, and carried the burden of a family name that had become synonymous with unspeakable acts. "I know what my great-uncles did," Thomas said without preamble, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My grandmother told me the stories when I came of age, made me understand why our family carries certain obligations to the community." Thomas revealed that the Keene family had been making quiet amends for decades, providing anonymous support to survivors and their families, contributing to community funds that helped women in desperate situations, and using their influence to prevent similar crimes from occurring in subsequent generations. "It wasn't justice by your standards," Thomas continued, "but it was acknowledgement and restitution of a kind. We've been trying to balance the scales without destroying the lives of people who had nothing to do with the original crimes, but would suffer from their public exposure." Samuel realized with dawning horror that his investigation had disrupted a complex system of informal accountability that, while imperfect, had provided some measure of healing and protection for the community's most vulnerable members. Samuel's final moment of devastating clarity came when Doc Harrison arrived at the camp carrying disturbing news about Rebecca Mills. The old physician had received word that Rebecca, in her desperate flight from Pine Hollow, had suffered what appeared to be a complete emotional collapse, ending up in a charity hospital in St. Louis, where she was being treated for severe melancholia and self-inflicted injuries. She tried to cut her own throat rather than face the possibility of having her story told in newspapers. Harrison reported, his voice breaking with grief and accusation. 20 years of healing destroyed in a few weeks because someone decided her privacy was less important than his version of justice. The weight of Rebecca's attempted suicide crushed the last remnants of Samuel's self-righteousness, forcing him to confront the terrible possibility that his crusade had been driven not by genuine compassion, but by his own psychological needs. Samuel remembered the desperate woman who had sought sanctuary at his church years earlier, the one he had turned away, because helping her would have complicated his relationship with the town's leading families. Her subsequent suicide had haunted him ever since, driving his subsequent commitment to championing the voiceless and confronting injustice wherever he found it. But now Samuel recognized that his zealous advocacy might have been less about serving others, and more about assuaging his own guilt, using other people's traumas as opportunities for his own redemption. Samuel began the slow, painful process of examining his actions through the lens of humility rather than righteousness. He started making quiet visits to Pine Hollow's residents, not to gather more evidence or press for acknowledgement of crimes, but to offer genuine apologies for the harm his investigation had caused. These conversations were difficult and often hostile, but they taught Samuel important lessons about the difference between bearing witness and exploiting suffering, between seeking justice and demanding satisfaction. Many residents rejected his apologies outright, but a few were willing to engage with him on the condition that he abandoned his plans to involve outside authorities and accept the community's right to handle their own affairs according to their own understanding of healing and accountability. Samuel's transformation accelerated when he began working directly with the people his investigation had harmed most severely. He spent days helping families repair relationships damaged by his accusations, mediating conversations between relatives who had been divided by conflicting loyalties and competing versions of truth. The work was unglamorous and often frustrating, requiring him to set aside his desire for dramatic gestures in favor of small acts of service that might contribute to genuine healing. Samuel discovered that true ministry often involved not grand pronouncements about justice, but quiet presence with people struggling to make sense of complicated realities that resisted simple moral categories. The process of rebuilding trust in Pine Hollow taught Samuel that redemption was a collaborative effort that required the consent and participation of everyone involved, including those whose suffering had initially motivated his crusade. Justice, he learned, was not something that could be imposed from outside, but had to emerge organically from within communities as they developed their own understanding of accountability, forgiveness, and healing. Samuel's role was not to be the hero of anyone else's story, but to serve as a faithful witness who could bear the weight of difficult truths without trying to transform them into comfortable narratives of triumph over evil.